Hello and welcome. This is the coffee break briefing for Monday, the 9th of May 2022, and I'm going to be talking about mortgages, charges and debentures. This is really a bit of a refresher rather than talking about anything very new. These are the topics that I'm going to be talking about this morning. I'm going to be looking at the different types of charges that there are, mainly looking at fixed charges, floating charges, but some of the other categories as well. I'll be talking a bit about why we need to categorize charges into different types. Then I'll move on to look at how a charge or mortgage works, and that will mainly be with reference to fixed charges. And then after that, I'll look at how floating charges work. And the final thing I'll be talking about is registration at Companies House. So let's start with looking at the different categories of charges, and I will say a bit more about why it matters later, but briefly there are two main reasons. The first one is about the priority of charges. As a general rule, secured creditors rank ahead of unsecured creditors, and also secured creditors hardly ever rank equally between themselves. It normally takes a deed of priority to do that. So there are always priority issues as between different charges, and categorizing the charge helps to deal with those priority issues. The second reason for categorizing charges is that secured creditors have rights that unsecured creditors don't. And there are two broad types of rights that they have. There are property rights, because security is actually itself a form of ownership. And there are contractual rights, because there will always be a contract between the lender and the borrower, and the mortgage document itself will always contain contractual terms. The property rights themselves come under two further categories. They are either statutory rights, the main statutes being the Law of Property Act and the Insolvency Act, and then there are also equitable or legal rights that they have simply by virtue of being effectively an owner of the property with a particular interest. So in terms of the categories, lots of different words that are used to distinguish different types of mortgage. I'll talk about some of those in a moment. And it's also important to think about things that look like charges, but which are not. So there's a few there that I'll just pull out. For example, a pledge, that's basically pawnbroking. And that is where the owner of the items being pledged will physically hand over possession to the lender, to the pawnbroker. So the security under a pledge, the person giving the security no longer has possession of it. Then we've got things like retention of title and conditional sale, and they're different from mortgage charge security, because under those arrangements, the person selling the goods, selling the property, continues to own complete title to it until they have been paid in full. So the person, the buyer, the person in possession of the goods does not have any interest in them, because title is entirely held by the person selling them. Then there's arrangements like hire purchase and leasing and hire arrangements, again where ownership remains with the person providing the credit and the person in possession does not have title to them. And then there are arrangements such as invoice discounting and factoring, under which debts are assigned and are bought by the financier. Now I imagine that a lot of those could themselves be subject of a coffee break and briefing. So if you'll be interested in me talking about, for example, factoring and invoice discounting or retention of title, or indeed all of these here, please let me know and I'll schedule it in for a future coffee break briefing. So let's look at charges, and let's look at what you get with a charge. And that is where the owner of property, we'll call them the debtor, grants a security interest over the property that they own to someone else to whom they owe a financial obligation. and we'll call that person to whom they owe the financial obligation the creditor. It's usually going to be a debt, but it can be other types of financial obligation. The characteristics of a charge is that the debtor, the owner of the property, remains in possession of their property, and the creditor does not take possession, at least not at the outset, and their interest in the property is limited to a right over the proceeds of sale, and is limited to the value of the financial obligation. So it's not like co-ownership, where somebody might have a 50% interest in the property, and the value of that interest will go up and down with the value of the property. The creditor's interest under a charge is the amount of the financial obligation, including the original principal, any accrued interest, and any charges that they may be entitled to add to it. That's charges in the financial sense rather than the security property sense. There's a lot of ambiguity in this language, I'm afraid. I mean, we've just come across it there with two separate meanings of the word charge. And the word mortgage has at least two meanings as well. Banks' marketing departments will call the big loan that they lend you to buy your house, they'll call that a mortgage. Lawyers call a mortgage a type of charge, which is commonly used to secure the big loan that's used to buy your home, hence the dual meaning there. But if you can imagine a Venn diagram here, a mortgage is a type of charge. Some mortgages are charges. All mortgages are charges, but not all charges are mortgages. And a mortgage is, it normally gives the creditor better rights than other types of security do, both in terms of priority and in terms of powers. So if you're taking security by way of charge, a mortgage is better than most other types of charge. Second distinction that you will come across is that charges are all either legal or equitable, and all charges will be either a legal charge or an equitable charge, and no charge can be both legal and equitable. The distinction there goes back absolutely hundreds of years in English land law, but the key thing is that as a generalization, a legal charge will rank ahead of an equitable charge, and equitable charges are easier to create. For example, it used to be possible to create an equitable charge simply by passing the title deeds to your home over the counter at a bank as security for a loan. There's now slightly more formality than that needed, but it used to be easy to create an equitable charge in a very informal way. There are some charges which can only be equitable charges, and the best example I can think of that is a floating charge. Every floating charge is necessarily an equitable charge. Okay, another distinction that we come across is we talk about registered charges and unregistered charges. Unregistered charges are usually bad news for the lender, but when we talk about registration of a charge, we can talk about registration in a number of different registries, and some charges, many charges, need to be registered in at least 2 registries. So, for example, the best known one probably is Companies House, and all charges created by companies have to be registered at Companies House, and there are similar rules for charges created by industrial and provident societies and other types of mutual society registered by the Financial Conduct Authority. Their charges have to be registered with the FCA. The High Court runs a bills of sale registry for some charges that are created by individuals and partners. And within the Land Registry, there is a Land Charges Department, and within the Land Charges Department, there is an Agricultural Credits Department that deals with the registration of fixed and floating charges created by farmers who are sole traders or partnerships. Those are, if you like, the compulsory registers, and then there are the others which are suppose you could call them the voluntary registers, and the best known of those is the Land Registry, which, as you'd expect, deals with land, or most of the land in England and Wales. There's the Land Charges Department of the Land Registry, which runs a different registration system for the land that is not registered at the Land Registry. There's the Ship Register for ships. The Civil Aviation Authority runs a registry for aircraft, and the Intellectual Property Office runs a registry for patents, registered trademarks, and registered designs. And charges and mortgages over land, ships, aircraft, and intellectual property can all be registered at those respective registries. I've described it as compulsory to register a charge at Companies House and the related charges. That's because charges that should be registered there and are not are void. So consequences of non-registration are very serious. For the other registries, they're more about the priority of the charges. So a charge that is not registered there will still be technically valid, but it just won't carry the priority that it should until it is registered. And those other registries, again, sweeping generalization, they tend to be more relaxed about accepting registrations out of time than Companies House is. The Land Registry is the one that we deal with the most, of course, and I'll just mention now that there are several different ways of registering a charge at the Land Registry, depending upon what sort of charge it is, and those will broadly depend upon whether it's a legal charge or an equitable charge and what priority it's got. Question, do charges have to be in writing? The short answer is no. The more complicated answer is, but some do. And first off, an unwritten charge can only ever be an equitable charge. It can never be a legal charge. Even a charge created by a handshake has to be registered at Companies House if the borrower is a company. So there will be the registration form that will contain the details of what was agreed when the hands were shaken. I think I have once seen an unwritten charge that has been registered at Companies House. If it is a charge on land, then yes, it does have to be in writing, and yes, both the lender and the borrower have to sign it for it to be valid. And if it's a bill of sale, which are some types of charges created by individuals and partners, those have to be in writing, and they have to be in the statutory form, which largely consists of almost incomprehensible Victorian legal English. Right, let's have a look at floating charges as well, because they're very important in the world of insolvency. So what's different about a floating charge from a fixed charge? Well, generally speaking, floating charges almost always have lower priority than fixed charges. Again, that can be varied by a deed of priority, but generally speaking, floating charges rank behind fixed charges. The crucial thing about a fixed charge is that it blocks the owner of the assets, the borrower. It blocks them from dealing with those assets unless the lender releases them from the charge. So when there's a fixed charge over a piece of land, the borrower cannot create leases over that land. They cannot sell that land. They cannot mortgage it without the consent of the lender. Floating charge does not have that block, so the owner can deal with them in the normal course of their business without needing permission from the lender. So they're particularly useful for covering charges on things like stock in trade, which is going to be changing on a day-to-day basis. And you could have a large construction company, for example, which has got some huge plots of land that are being developed, being rebuilt as houses. And the lender might have a floating charge over that, because if every day there are 20 or 30 properties being sold from the site, they might not want to be involved in the administration of releasing each one of those from the security. There are lots of sweeping generalizations in this morning's presentation. Another one here is that floating charges are normally over a class of assets rather than over specific identified items. I don't think I've ever seen a floating charge over a specific identified item. But then fixed charges can also be over a class of assets as long as the lender has the necessary degree of control over those assets to prevent the borrower from dealing with them. And another piece of terminology here, there's some wonderfully mixed metaphors about floating charges, and crystallization describes the process of converting a floating charge into a fixed charge. And once a floating charge has crystallized, it is then a fixed charge. And from that point onwards, the borrower can only deal with the charged property if they have permission from the lender to do so. So that's the floating charge. When talking about floating charges, we often talk about debentures as well. And as with almost everything that I'm talking about today, debenture also has two meanings. In the world of corporate finance, a debenture describes an IOU from a company. It is a written document that acknowledges a debt that the company owes. And debentures can actually be secured or unsecured. I've recently been advising on a situation where there is a deferred debenture which actually gives priority to the unsecured creditors. Unusual, but in some cases it's a useful tool. In the world of insolvency, when we talk about a debenture, we're normally talking about a document usually drafted by a bank that contains a comprehensive battery of charges that charge almost everything, sometimes literally everything that the borrower, the company, owns. A bank debenture will always include a floating charge, and that floating charge will always extend to everything that the company has got. A debenture will normally contain many fixed charges as well, and actually some of those fixed charges will actually be floating charges, although they're described as fixed charges. And just as an aside there, when it comes to looking at the priority of payments, don't assume that a lender has a fixed charge just because the charge document says it is a fixed charge. It may well be a floating charge, and so subject to prior claims by preferential creditors, possibly the prescribed part. A bank debenture will always contain a qualifying floating charge, which will give the bank the power to appoint an administrator under Schedule B1. And that's one of the whole points of the debenture. You may occasionally come across debentures that empower the lender to appoint an administrative receiver. They used to be very, very common, much more rare these days, of course, because there are very few occasions when it is permitted to appoint an administrative receiver. Right, so that's talked about the different categories of charge. So let's look briefly at why we need to categorize them. And as I said before, there's really two reasons. Validity, that some charges need particular formalities to be valid, and priority, that charges hardly ever rank equally among themselves. There will almost always be an order of priority as between the secured creditors. And there are some general rules about that. Legal charges normally rank over equitable charges. Older charges normally rank over newer charges. Registered charges, where we're talking about priority registers here, registered charges normally rank over unregistered charges, and fixed charges will normally rank ahead of floating charges. Now, when I was at university, my lecturer set us a question. I can't remember the detail of it, but it was essentially a circular order of priority where charge A had priority over charge B had priority over charge C, and yet applying the rules, charge C managed to have priority over charge A. So the question was, who has priority? Fortunately, a situation that I've never encountered in real life. So here's a waterfall diagram to show how the priority works. In this case, we will assume that each one of the classes of creditor is repaid in full. So we've got £1 million of asset realizations here, probably a single asset, probably a freehold property, and we've got the first fixed charge holder being repaid in full with £150,000. Same happening to the second charge holder. After that, the ordinary preferential creditors are paid in full with £50,000, as are the secondary preferential creditors. And then there is the prescribed part going to the ordinary creditors, and that's a percentage of the remaining fund. That prescribed part is paid out in full, after which the first floating charge holder is paid in full with £100,000. The same going to the second floating charge holder. The ordinary unsecured creditors receive £250,000, which amazingly pays them out in full. And in this particular priority distribution, the shareholders end up with £27,000 at the end of the queue. I'll look a bit at the historical background about mortgages, particularly land mortgages, as these date back literally to 1066 and the Norman Conquest. And as long as there have been landowners, there have been money lenders, and they have been taking security on the land. So we've got here a baron who wants to go off on crusade and borrows the money to do it, and he will have conveyed the title to his estate to the money lender, coupled with a deed of defeasance. And the deed of defeasance is essentially the loan agreement saying, in effect, that if the baron manages to repay the debt in full by the due date, then the moneylender will be obliged to transfer the baron's estate back to him. And the baron goes off with his money on crusade to go and plunder foreign lands and get rich, leaving his estate in the hands of his steward. And all that he now owns is the right to have ownership reconveyed to him, assuming he comes back alive and enriched and is able to repay the loan. And that residual right that he has got in his property, because legal ownership is now with the moneylender, that residual right that he has got is called the equity of redemption. And that is why we still describe the net value that the owner of mortgage property has, why we still describe their net value as the equity. It is that equity of redemption, and the historical background to it is nearly 1,000 years. I have to say that contemporary mortgages of land no longer work like that, with absolute legal ownership being transferred to the lender. But mortgages of some other types of property may work like that. A legal mortgage of land is normally a charge by legal mortgage, which leaves the borrower still as the legal owner of the property, and it confers important property rights on the lender, and those include a power of sale, a right to possession, and the power to appoint receivers. And in addition to those statutory rights, there are often additional rights that are given by the terms of the mortgage itself. The important thing is that although the lender's interest looks very, very close to ownership of the property, it is limited financially to the debt that they are owed. And when it comes to asking for permission to sell the property, the borrower cannot sell the land while there is a mortgage or charge registered at the land registry, unless the lender agrees to release their security. And the buyer will always insist on that, because otherwise they are at risk of taking over the seller's mortgage and having to repay somebody else's debt. And that is the land registry form DS1 that's used for that, and I'm sure you will have seen many of those in practice yourself. And charges on other assets are very, very similar in terms of the lender having a power of sale and control of the asset. I won't say any more about that slide. I'll move on to talk about how a floating charge works. And I'm categorizing floating charges into 3 types. There's the qualifying floating charge, which is a comprehensive charge where the lender has got security over pretty much everything that the company owns, and a qualifying floating charge gives the lender the statutory right to appoint an administrator. You sometimes find a supplementary floating charge, and what I'm talking about there is something like a mortgage deed over a piece of land, where there is a floating charge tucked away in some of the paragraphs in the charge document to add to the security that the lender has got and give them a bit more control than they otherwise would have. And you do very occasionally come across a lightweight floating charge, which is a type of qualifying floating charge, but it's a very short, succinct document, and it's one where the lender never intends to appoint an administrator themselves, but they would want the right to be given advance notice of it if their customer, the borrower, is intending to do that. And floating charges can be created by corporations, including companies. They cannot be created by individuals or partnerships unless they're farmers. Floating charges normally catch a class of assets. So, for example, all present and future stock in trade, or all present and future assets, property and undertaking of the company. And they will allow the borrower to deal with the property that is caught by the floating charge without needing any further consent from the lender to do that. And that will last right up until the time when the floating charge crystallizes and becomes a fixed charge. And on crystallization, then the floating charge is a fixed charge in terms of the powers and the property rights that the lender has got. But crystallization of a floating charge does not change the priority of the floating charge, and that's because the definition used in the Insolvency Act for a floating charge is a floating charge that was a floating charge as created. So crystallization of a floating charge into a fixed charge does not affect its priority. That slide just summarizes the situations in which a floating charge can crystallize. I won't say any more about it. Just mention the last 2 points there, that a crystallized floating charge can protect the company's assets from execution creditors. There may be cases when it's useful to know that. And that administrators have a statutory right to deal with property that's caught by a crystallized floating charge. So although the floating charge crystallizes on appointment of administrators, the administrators do not need to ask the bank for permission to sell the assets that were caught by the floating charge. This slide here about the appointment formalities is actually quite important. When we were dealing with a lot of receiverships, it was absolutely critical to get this right, otherwise the appointment of receivers would be invalid. Key thing is that before you can appoint receivers, and the same thing applies to administrators, before you can make the appointment, the charge has to become enforceable. And to make the charge enforceable, the lender has to first off make formal demand for repayment in writing, and before that they need to check that they've got the right to call in the loan and make formal demand. So assuming they've got that right, they will then make immediate formal demand for repayment, and then before they do anything else, they have to allow the borrower an opportunity to pay the debt. Even when they know that the borrower can't and won't pay the debt, they still have to give them the opportunity to do so, and that is an absolute minimum of 1 hour while the banks are open. The idea is that the borrower should have the opportunity to instruct the bank to pay the lender from somewhere, transfer the funds. I say 1 hour is the absolute minimum. I say 2 hours is polite. And only then, only when the demand has been served and at least 1 banking hour has passed, only then is the charge enforceable and a valid appointment can be made. I'm slightly surprised that we haven't yet seen any cases where an administration appointment has been declared invalid through not following this procedure rigidly, but I think it's only a matter of time before we do. Final point to talk about is registration at Companies House. As you know, companies who create security have to register it within 21 days at Companies House. And there are similar rules for other corporations and in some cases individuals and partners who are charging some of their property. And if a charge should be registered at Companies House and is not registered within 21 days, it is void. And effectively the lender is unsecured. Companies House has no discretion to accept late registration. If the charge is delivered on day 22, it will not be registered without a court order. And getting a court order for late registration is problematical because the court order will normally order the lender to share their security with all other pre-existing lenders, all other pre-existing creditors. So they will not be the only party entitled to that security. Sometimes to avoid that, we see lenders who have missed the registration window. We will see them asking their borrower to sign another charge and register that with a later date on it. That is potentially risky because that charge could be set aside, if it's a floating charge, under section 245 of the Insolvency Act, or if it's a fixed or a floating charge, it could be set aside as a preference under section 239. So that is not a good way of doing it. Right, I have covered all of the points, so if anyone has any questions, please do ask now, or if you want to give me a call later or drop me an email, I'll be very happy to chat about this, or indeed anything completely unrelated. So you know where to get hold of me, so I'll put my contact details up in a minute. And I will now just take the opportunity to remind you of the date of our inaugural insolvency conference, which is Friday the 10th of June in Bournemouth. It's an all-day conference with time for you to enjoy a glass of wine or beer in the sunshine afterwards. And it's not yet too late to book. And the next coffee break briefing will be in July, on the 11th of July. Right, so there are my contact details. Thank you all very much, and I do hope to see you in June at our conference, and if not, at the coffee break briefing in July. I may see some of you this Thursday at Denby's Wine Estate for the SESCA seminar. Thank you very much, and goodbye.